Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Actual Magician Explains. In this episode we are going to be taking a look at the secrets that are taught by occult orders, particularly throughout the last 2 centuries. We're going to be taking a look at how the curriculum of magical orders and magical groups, occult groups, developed in order to teach members or students of that group both the materials and the concepts and the methods that each group actually taught. This was the subject of my thesis for my master's degree in Western Esotericism at Exeter University. So I'll be referencing some of that as well. This also draws on first-hand material collected from occult groups over the last 45 years, including BOTA, Amos, the Golden Dawn, the OTO, and other groups. Now, I can't exactly reveal all of the secrets because a lot of occult, which means hidden, is based on experience. It's the experience of doing the work. This is why we say in our own occult order, by our work we are changed. Because performing a magical ritual, learning magical concepts, applying them, is only part of the journey. So we're also going to be looking at some of the themes that occultism actually teaches us, and some of these themes that actually elevate our state of awareness through progressive grades of awareness, which in effect make up the Western Esoteric Initiatory system, certainly the one that I teach. I'd like to start with this Kabbalistic diagram, which we can see intimations of the whole initiatory journey and the teachings of each grade in this diagram, which is entirely independent of some of the other common formulations we're going to look at, such as the Golden Dawn or a century earlier in the German order of the Golden Rosy Cross. This illustration is found in a Syriac Bible dated around 1555. And I'd like to take a look at each of the Sephiroth in this diagram individually so we can get a general idea of the secret teaching that's being made through this diagram. So, looking in the mandala to the left of the diagram, we can see the Tree of Life with the crown of Kether at the top. And we can see down at the bottom in the Sephira that is Malkuth that we have an image of the Grail. It's a cup. And this connects across, and here we see the science of correspondence at work and symbolism. It connects across to the heart of the Christ figure on the cross. So this is symbolic in a sense of the heart of the Zelator, the person entering Malkuth for the first time on the mystical, magical initiatory path. Their enthusiasm is now being awakened already from their own Tifrith centre, their own heart, which is also drawn to the same position on that Christ figure. And the Golden Dawn stated that the lower grades, in a sense, quit not Malkuth, and also that in Tifrith, the grades are further subdivided into recapitulating each of the lower grades. So in effect we have to redo the work of the 4 lower grades as we now have a new sense of awareness in Tifrith. And here we can see that idea in diagrammatic form. Indeed, there is actually a ladder with rungs in the grade of Tifrith, as we can see in the illustration, the ladder that is in front of the sun, which is our sense of pure awareness that is right in the heart of the Tree of Life and our own being. Then in Yesod, as we look up the Tree of Life, we can see the figure of Atlas holding the globe, and it's a figure of bearing the weight of the world on your shoulders. And this is the same world that we now see that is below in the Tree of Life in the illustration. And it is now lit by fire, which has become the slow burning fire of calcination in the life of the initiate. The Theoricus in this grade has realized that the world is their own projection, and they've got to exhaust this state before making any progress. The line drawn out of Yesod is going to the genitals of the figure of Christ, indicating the generative nature of the grade as well as its primary attachment and some of the dangers of obsession with sexuality that belong to that grade itself. We can then take a look at the figure of Jacob sleeping at the bottom of Jacob's ladder that is in the Tifereth, and we can make sense of each of the other illustrations within this diagram to the teaching system of the Western Esoteric Initiatory system. And of course, as I said, this is dated into the mid-1500s, long before the Golden Dawn came along to really systematize this teaching into a curriculum that could be followed by the student. So when we consider the grades within the initiatory system, we can see that a lot of the systems have usually 10 grades of progression, but these are broken into separate orders, like an inner order, an outer order, and so forth, that have very different approaches and priorities and concerns for the student at that grade, at that order, within that order. And in effect, we have the neophyte, we then have the zealotor, we have the theoricus, the practicus, the philosophus, the adeptus minor, and we go up the tree through these grades. But they all have their own unique challenges, their own unique resources that we then learn to draw upon, and their own lessons. And this is really why I teach a 3-minute method of tarot, where we look at each card in terms of its challenge, resource, and lesson, because it's my sneaky way of introducing into tarot cards and into tarot card reading the fundamental notions that if that student then progresses into the Western Esoteric Initiatory system, they've already learned something that is then of use in understanding the grades and the Sephiroth and the teachings therein. So this is really one of the important things about having a structure, having a understanding or appreciation of learning itself and of teaching itself as a tool, a system, a methodology, in that we can make progressive teaching build on itself and not have to have the student unlearn something that they've learnt in some sort of mistaken way or in some sort of way that is not useful. One of the things that we used to have a joke when I was in a sort of network magical order back in the 80s was that this secret is reserved for a higher grade. If we didn't know the answer to something, we would just nod sagely and say, yes, this secret is reserved for a higher grade. And there is a sense sometimes of it's far better not to teach something if you don't know the aim or ambition or destination for that particular bit of teaching, rather than teach something that then the student has to unlearn or sends them down a path of understanding that the rest of the teaching can't then feed into or contradicts and is rejected by the student as being not relevant or not understandable in some way. It's far better to have a structure underneath the teaching that can then be progressively built upon, even if that teaching is in effect to take away those scaffolding poles eventually and leave the student where you've taken them to without necessarily their knowledge of where the destination is. And as we have seen in my video on the top 10 magical books I'd recommend for the absolute beginner to occultism and the occult and the Western Esoteric Initiatory system, a lot of this actually goes all the way back to the Hermetica and the Hermetic teachings, this version by Brian P. Copenhaver. We have the sort of, in fact, my note here, grades and the path of exhaustion. We have a notion of the ascent narrative going back all the way to Hermetica, all the way back to Kabbalah, all the way back to the practice of Mithraism that was competing with Christianity originally. So we have this notion of the ascent narrative built in, hard baked into our systems of Western esotericism. So whilst the Golden Dawn may have been the more recent, I guess, synthesis of all of these teachings, but that was based on Freemasonry, the SRIA, the Golden Rosy Cross in Germany that we looked at in a previous video. There is a sense of a overarching structure and a commonality with the steps, and we can call them 10 steps of Kabbalah, we could call them the 7 steps of astrology, we could call them the 12 steps of alchemy. We can break the model down into lots of different ways to look at it. But nonetheless, the teaching still remains the same, much like the song, and there's a sense of comparison between each of these systems. I think we can begin by looking at the general concepts that are taught implicitly or explicitly within magical orders. The academic Antoine Faivre suggested that there are actually 6 components identified for esoteric thought itself as a definition, so perhaps these are also taught or found or implicit within magical orders. These are correspondence, which I've talked about in previous videos, living nature, the idea of nature as being aware or alive in some form or another, imagination and mediation, so the idea of intermediaries and levels, whether they be angelic, demonic, spiritual, graduated, abstract, that there are a sort of set of mediations between us and the divine. Some idea or experience of transmutation through alchemical processes, through magical processes, some change that we undergo as occultists or magicians. The practice of concordance, that's an interesting one. That's more about the social concerns of esoteric groups. How do we relate our life to the life of those around us in a form of social equality or inequality, as we have in, say, for example, Aleister Crowley's Thelemic notions that the slave shall serve and so forth. But we can identify within his teaching, within Golden Dawn teaching, within any other occult teaching, that there is some statements or some ideas about our role in society. And then finally, the idea of transmission, the idea of a tradition. And even if I joke that the only magical tradition that we can identify and is consistent is the idea that every magical tradition invents its own magical tradition, then in effect that is still a statement about the transmission of the teaching itself. So we really pull down to these 3 main overarching concepts that we have in occult teaching. The idea of correspondence as a living nature, an interconnection, a mediation, a set of grades or hierarchies or spirits or demons or some other structure that corresponds with our real experience and through which we pass. And again, this goes back to Hermetic ideas originally. We then have the idea, the central idea of an ascent narrative through a hierarchy, through a grade system, through a curriculum, that we can actually make this journey. And as René Guénon says, that it has landmarks, that it has certain signposts that we find along the way in our own experience, in the experience we have of the world through magical technique and training. And also a sense of gnosis, a sense of a Gnostic idea that our personal salvation is through ourselves, it's through our own initiation, it's through our own ministry work, our own effort, our own will, our own struggle, our own work, that we are changed in itself. And as the song has it, there are many people who want to fly to heaven, but there are few prepared to make the climb. And I think these 3 things are really at the heart of the teaching: correspondence, the ascent narrative, and personal salvation. They may seem quite obvious when we say them out loud, but we must remember that they are at the heart of occult teaching. And again, going back to what Faivre said, we can identify these 6 components in all of the methods that we're going to look at of correspondence, living nature, imagination and mediation, experience of transmutation, the practice of concordance, and transmission of the teaching, which is something we're not necessarily going to look at in detail in this particular video. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley, and to some extent the teachings of the FRC, which was Waite's mystical fellowship that he developed out of the Golden Dawn. And indeed, Crowley developed, along with the Golden Dawn, he developed OTO teachings and something that he called the AA, which was more of an individual-based rather than group working progression through the initiatory system. Interestingly enough, there is a paper by McGregor Mathers, S.L. McGregor Mathers, on the least amount of work necessary for a particular grade. It's almost as if they were answering the question even back then as to, is all of this work really necessary? And they were trying to get to the heart of what was most important to learn. So what would a Golden Dawn initiate be required to learn from the curriculum? Well, there's a paper in about 1897 that was given by Mathers to the members of the Second Order in Caledonia, which it indicates the regulations for progression through the grades of the order. There are also some political statements in there about which works to avoid. For example, it says the works of the Lake Harris School are better avoided. The HB of L, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, is condemned, as of course are Luciferian or Palladistic teachings. The so-called Rose Cross of Sor Paladin is considered an ignorant perversion of the name. The Black Mass is naturally, by its own confession, of the evil Magick school. So there is a sense of trying to sit their teachings against other people's teachings, even back in the Golden Dawn. But then it goes on to summarise the work of the grades between, in this case, Neophyte Adeptus Minor and Theoricus Adeptus Minor. So two of the broken down grades within Adeptus Minor, where you have to recapitulate or redo all of the work, or at least revision all of the previous work that you've done from the new light of awareness that you have as an Adeptus Minor. So, for example, in the second stage of Celator Adeptus Minor, the candidate would receive and study flying rolls, which were numbered 11, 12, 14, 20, 21, and so forth, and then pass C, G, and E examinations. Again, there was a lot of emphasis on the scholarly study, and this goes back to Freemasonic presentations that are given in the lodges. So there is a sense of this being recapitulated within the order itself. What was actually in these teachings? Well, those particular flying rolls, which was the name given to subsidiary papers that weren't to be considered part of the curriculum, but were then found to be very important to make sense of the curriculum. These flying rolls enumerated different instructions on clairvoyance, talismanic images, which was used as a form of active imagination to voyage into the talismanic image and explore the landscape and the denizens of astral landscapes through the images. Talismans, which would require a knowledge of correspondence and basic ritual of purification, consecration, invocation of the required force for the talisman, the construction of the talisman, the choice of the talisman, and then the enacting of the magical consecration of that, and then the closing of the ritual. So something as simple as talismans that was then taken out of the Golden Dawn and via Austin Osman's spare into chaos magic, as seen as a shortcut to magical practice, was actually within the Golden Dawn a fundamental part of testing whether you understood the whole set of correspondences, the whole principles of ritual and so forth, in order to correctly and effectively empower a talisman for a desired aim that could then be tested whether the aim of the talisman was then accomplished. There were also flying rolls on the perspectives on the psychic constitution of man, the planets and tattvas, scrying rules, use of ritual implements, for example the lotus wand, magical sword, the platen, all sorts of things were actually being taught within those flying rolls. Now, it's actually apparent that many members did construct implements for their magical working. The poet W.B. Yeats, who was initiated into the Golden Dawn in 1890, describes, quote, "We copied out everything we could borrow or find that bore upon our subject, including the Jewish Shem Forash with its 72 names of God in Hebrew characters. But he also constructed the 4 elemental weapons and his own lotus wand, its pentacle bearing his own motto, Demon est Deus inversus, the devil is God reversed or inverse. There's a plate in Gilbert's Golden Dawn scrapbook that shows a similar item of regalia, the Rose Cross layman, as created by another member, Benjamin Cox. So all of these implements were being made. They were actually copying the diagrams, they were copying the descriptions of the tarot cards, they were learning the Hebrew alphabet and so forth. Now it's actually Yeats who really strongly defended the magical curriculum and the grade system in a very famous pamphlet which was called Is the Order of the RR and AC to Remain a Magical Order, which was written as the Golden Dawn was facing internal conflicts and some external ones in 1901. Yeats wrote a defence of the system of examinations. Actually, A.E. Waite was looking to abolish them. Obviously, Waite then went on to found his own order, the FRC, with very, very long and wordy rituals that are far closer to Catholic religious practices than magical Freemasonic Golden Dawn type of practices. But Yeats actually wrote, "The passing of exams by their means from one degree to another is an evocation of the supreme life, a treading of a symbolic path, a passage through a symbolic gate, a climbing towards the light, which it is the essence of our system to believe flows continually from the lowest of the invisible degrees to the highest of the degrees that are known to us." We can see there that Yeats is actually saying that the essence of the system is the initiatory work, is the grade system, is the ascent narrative through mediations, through these steps that have been identified as being able to return us to a sense of divine unity. Now, Aleister Crowley did develop a lot of the teachings and the curriculum from the Golden Dawn, but he then modified it quite comprehensively using materials from the OTO. Now, Crowley does warn that these grades are not necessarily attained fully and in strict consecution, or manifest wholly on all planes. He makes the point that the grade system is not necessarily a rigid and linear system. But he does give a detailed account of the knowledge required for each grade and of the training plan. And the first part of which I'll quote briefly, he says that for the student, his business is to acquire a general intellectual knowledge of all systems of attainment as declared in the prescribed books. So basically, a big reading list and an understanding of the systems of magical practice. The probationer, his principal business is to begin such practices as he may prefer and to write a careful record of the same for 1 year. And this is that idea of a 1 year and a day apprenticeship or waiting period before you actually join the magical order. In our order, for example, the Order of Everlasting Day, we have the Crucible Club, which lasts a year and it teaches some of the fundamental points of the Western Esoteric Initiatory system that I teach. Then the neophyte has to acquire perfect control of the astral plane. So in our terms of our magical order, for example, this is really work to do with dream control, lucid dreaming, dream recollection, and the inner guide meditation and other forms of active imagination. So here we're working on our yesod, we're working on our psyche, our personality, and more importantly, we're working on the language of symbolism that then connects us at this grade to the universe. We go from seeing a literal universe in Malkuth, our everyday reality, to a symbolic one in Yesod. Then that relationship changes and shifts with the teachings of each grade as we then progress. And Crowley goes on to describe the practicus as expected to complete his intellectual training, to study the Kabbalah, the philosophers to complete their moral training, in which case they are also tested in their devotion to the order before they can enter the next grade and the next order which is different to the outer order of those preceding grades. Here are some examples of a test that Aleister Crowley gave to a student who was called Dr. Braithwaite. Number 1. Give the principal correspondences of the letter Teth and your comments. Again, in that question, we can see the idea of mediation, intermediaries, and correspondence. Number 2. Explain the real value of yoga practice for anyone attempting to make spiritual progress. Number 3. What do you know of the psychology of Buddhism? So we've almost got comparative religious studies being taught at a very basic level in the magical initiatory system. Number 4. How would you set to work to produce a magical thunderstorm or to acquire by means of a magical ceremony a book of which you were in need? And again, we can now see the practical application of correspondences, of mediation, of ritual understanding that Aleister Crowley is checking that the person can produce something that is testable as to whether it does produce a thunderstorm or a book that the student needs. Next question or test is set up a geomantic figure for the result of the presidential election in November and forecast the consequences to the USA. So again, we've got that social interest that we were talking about in the 6 characteristics of occultism from Anton Fevre, the nature of social engagement and the context of the adept or initiate within their own society. Another question was, give an account of the Rosicrucian philosophy, laying stress on the true meaning of the symbol of the Rosy Cross. So there is a particular understanding required there of testable practice, testable understanding of the basic concepts of correspondence, which we've seen is so important. And it wasn't only the Golden Dawn who were developing these sorts of ideas. It was, for example, within the Theosophical school, within a book like this, The Light of Egypt, where we have A Science of the Soul and the Stars by Thomas Burgoyne, or Zanoni. And this was reprinted in 1963, but was actually copyright in 1889, which was just 1 year after the Golden Dawn itself was formed. And here we have A Science of the Soul and its structured teaching, Soul Knowledge Book 1, Book 2, Book 3. And here we have the mystical cycle of the sun, a very similar teaching to Liber Resh. We have, quite interestingly, a whole chapter on the mysteries of sex, so a form of sexual magic that was taken from Eastern ideas, and then ideas on the relationship of the cosmos and one's own state of awareness. For example, the nature and influence of the 12 signs, the planets, the alchemical nature of man. So in an older book like this, we still have that structure and the idea of teaching alchemy and teaching, in this case, mediumship and a form of spiritualism and so forth. This is really that handover between the psychic and a spiritualist type of movement and the new thought movement into occultism itself, with a dash of ancient Egypt and the Far East and so forth, all blending into a Western Esotericism that was being formed in real time. Now, there are 4 primary methods that we teach in the Order of Everlasting Day, our own private magical order, and in the Crucible Club, which is the application process by which you join our order, of which many orders do have a testing period or trial period for students to work out if that particular group is for them. And these 4 methods that we primarily teach and ask students to learn off by heart are Liber Resh, the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, the Middle Pillar, and the Rose Cross. And these are particular techniques. Now, Liber Resh is more from Aleister Crowley's work, although it has parallels to other forms of occultism. And this is really an observation that we take at the stations of the sun throughout the day and into the night, into midnight. And in effect, this orientates the magical practitioner to time. The lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, whilst it involves pentagrams and the archangels and the Kabbalistic cross, this actually orientates the practitioner in space. So we have two primary methods: the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, which orientates us in space, and Liber Resh, which orientates us in time. Then the middle pillar exercise, which involves in effect identifying and lighting up the Sephiroth in correspondence to the positions of the body, and then drawing the light down, or sometimes fountaining it out into one's aura. This is a technique that realigns ourselves to ourselves, and therefore we have a new relationship, a magical relationship to self. So we have the lesser banishing ritual, space, Liber Resh, time, and middle pillar, self. And then the Rose Cross ritual, which is a beautiful ritual to practice and is good for healing and sending healing work, or closing your whole sense of engagement with the world down. This really engages us with the sphere of existence around us and the divine part of that. So in effect, these four basic methods, I think they are the four basic methods because they orientate us to time with Liber Resh, space with the lesser banishing ritual, self with the middle pillar, and relationship to the divine through the Rose Cross. So in effect, underneath the secret teachings are other secret teachings which you learn through practicing them. Over years and years and years and years of practice, you start to recognize in oneself the actual utility and purpose of each of these steps, why they're progressive, why they're taught in a certain way, why they can't be unlearned. This is one key characteristic of initiatory teaching, that it can't actually be unlearned. And of course, there are many variations of the initiatory system, of the grade teachings, and indeed of the methods and language used within each particular order. For example, the Aurum Solis order, which is written about in the magical philosophy books by Denning and Phillips, the ones up here, but in more recent books as Ogdoadic Magick by Norman Kraft and the Aurum Solis book here by Osborne Phillips, these have a variation, a more, I guess, Greek formed rather than ancient Egyptian formed variation, a more poetic form of ritual and language than the Golden Dawn. But it does derive a lot of the patterning from the Golden Dawn and other sets of teaching. And I think we looked at the initiatory system in a previous video, and I'll be coming back to that in the next video on Kabbalah and the initiation system, certainly as I teach it specifically. And it's not to say that a structured way of teaching, a grade system, a hierarchy, a teaching order is necessarily the only way to make spiritual, mystical, magical, psychological, practical progress in your life, because there are a lot of different ways of doing it. For example, the one-to-one teaching, the sort of guru teaching, or the shamanic teaching that we see in Carlos Castaneda and works of that ilk, or semi-fictional works like the Tales of an Anglo-Saxon Sorcerer, The Way of Weird by Brian Bates. This particular book is one of my favourite sort of imaginings of what it would be like to be taught by a experienced, wise, weird teacher out in the forests and out in the landscape. So there are many different ways of teaching. It's just very incumbent for you to find, if you're looking for the Western Esoteric Initiatory system, the method and the approach and the teachers that speak to you personally. So whilst Chaos Magic did seem to eject a hierarchical notion of teaching, a curriculum and so forth, the original books on Chaos Magic, particularly by Pete Carroll, did bring a experimental scientific approach to the methods and models of teaching Western esotericism, and a far more experimental attitude towards those teachings, albeit somewhat broken down into individual techniques with no unifying structure. However, one interesting idea in chaos theory, in catastrophe theory here, that was brought in Liber Null, I think, at the back of Liber Null, catastrophe theory, does have a unique model for initiation, for the growth of awareness, and then suddenly the sort of collapse point as it folds over a three-dimensional fold that we can refer to as initiation, when it's a little bit like catastrophe theory looks at things that appear to have one projection, one pattern, one idea of where they're going, and then suddenly they tip or they break or they fold underneath themselves. And this is a really good model of the initiatory process and the initiatory system itself. It needs to be modeled in a three-dimensional way rather than as a straight graph or a series of straight steps. And these systems do teach us through the actual practice and experience of magical, mystical and spiritual work through these grades that there is a progressively comprehensive, congruent and consistent sense of awareness that we can gain in a almost return journey to some sort of primal unification and sense of unity with the whole from which we came and which we are in presently, even if we don't feel connected to it. That the veils or the abysses of the initiatory system are those breaks that we have in the illusion of separation from everything. And that, in effect, is really what the occult orders are actually teaching, is that we are here, we are present, we are aware, and we are connected to everything, whether we know it or not, in our present state of awareness. And in much the same way that Paul Brunton wrote in The Hidden Teaching Beyond Yoga, is once you have engaged with these practices, once you have done this to your mind, once you have done this to your experience, what is it that remains? Where do we go beyond the teaching? And this is where our experience leads us to recognizing that we are ourselves the workshop, that the universe is the workshop in which we are constantly engaging and inquiring, as the universe is an act of inquiry. And through these teachings, we are learning to unlearn the illusion of separateness. And this is one of the overarching narratives, I think, of the Western Esoteric Initiatory system. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it's proven some interest to you. If so, please leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe to this channel if you want to be informed when I release each of the weekly videos. That would be very much appreciated. It does help with the YouTube algorithm, which seems as occult and esoteric as any of the teachings in any of the books that I have behind me or in the rest of the property. So thank you again, and I will leave you as we leave each of our members in the order of everlasting day, which is the worker is hidden in the workshop. Thank you.